Good morning. Welcome to Trinity Baptist Church once again. I wonder if during this past year, whilst we've been in various stages of lockdown and isolation, whether you've spent any time kind of either learning or perfecting a skill or a hobby. I was reading an article the other day looking at how different people had spent their time whilst being furloughed from work, and a couple of the stories in particular stood out to me. There was one person that had spent their time learning Japanese and had then moved on to start learning Spanish, although they were worried that they wouldn't have time to finish that before they had to start back at work. And there was another who'd spent their time memorising every line from every episode of the sitcom Friends. Who's to say which of those two skills is the more impressive, or which one will come in more handy in the future? For me, it's not quite a new skill, nor have I spent the time or the effort of either of those two individuals. But I have become a little bit obsessed recently with making soup. I've bought myself a soup maker, and it's definitely become something of a hobby of late, experimenting with different recipes and different ingredients. Now, you might wonder why I'm telling you this. Well, it's because I've decided that I ought to put it to some good use. You might remember that last March, just before we had to stop meeting in person, we held a big soup social in support of the M3 project. And we'd like to do that again this year. Now, for obvious reasons, we can't hold it in the same way as we did last time, with all of us here at the church eating together. And so instead, we want to deliver homemade soup to you, and that way we can kind of eat together, albeit in our own homes. And we're going to be holding our big soup social in a couple of weeks' time, on Sunday the 21st of March. And I've already spoken to Alison, who's agreed to help me make enough soup. And so in return for a donation to the M3 project, which can be made either online or in cash, you can order some soup to be delivered to you, and that will be delivered on Saturday the 20th of March. And there's a choice of 4 different soups. You can have tomato and red pepper, mushroom, lentil and chorizo, or vegetable. And you can order your soup by getting in touch with me, however you want to, by phone, email, Facebook, pigeon, however you want to get in touch with me, that's absolutely fine. And then on Sunday the 21st of March, for those who are able and who want to, we'll be having a food quiz on Zoom from 10:30, which will be then finished in just enough time for you to go and heat your soup up, ready to eat that at lunchtime. And I realise now that that's quite a lot of information in quite a short block of time. And so if you need any more details about that, or if you want to ask me any questions, please do get in touch with me. And please do remember to place your orders for soup, preferably before Wednesday the 17th of March, just so that we've got time to ensure that there are enough ingredients to make all the different kinds of soup. Okay, let's move on now then to this week's sermon. And the theme in our readings from the Lent course this week have been on stories of transformation. And it's remarkable as you read through the different stories of Jesus in the Gospels, you'll see that no one who encounters Jesus goes away the same as they were before that encounter. That is to say that no one goes away from Jesus unchanged or untransformed in some way. We see that in some of the readings from this week. The story from Monday, from Mark chapter 5, of the man living near the tombs of the Gerasenes who's healed and set free by Jesus. Or the woman at the well in John chapter 4 from Wednesday, who is accepted and welcomed by Jesus and set free from her shame. We also see the testimonies of Peter and John, disciples whose lives were transformed by a meeting with Jesus. And from Paul too, whose own encounter with Jesus comes like ours after Jesus has ascended back into heaven, but yet still he has his life turned upside down. There are countless other examples from the Gospels as well. The blind man came away seeing, the deaf man came away hearing, The lame left walking, the lepers went away cleansed, outsiders were welcomed, the sick got well, and the dead were raised to life. And at this point, you might be asking, well, what about those who didn't accept Jesus? What about the Pharisees and the others like them? Or people like the rich young ruler who goes away disappointed after being told to sell everything he owns? Well, ultimately, some go away glad, some go away sad, and others yet go away mad. But ultimately, no one leaves unchanged in some way. Jesus compels a choice and brings about a change. Some have their hearts melted, some have their hearts hardened, but no one is unchanged. And so then, as we think about our own lives, we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. Firstly, are we willing to be changed? Because make no mistake, as we draw close to Jesus, as we invite him into our lives, however tinily we kind of open that door, he will change us. He will transform us. For some, that will be a dramatic change. For the Gerasenes demoniac from Mark chapter 5, whose story you might remember we also looked at back in August. The change is dramatic, isn't it? It's instantaneous as he's healed and restored and set free. Paul's transformation, which you can read about in Acts chapter 9, is similarly dramatic, albeit in a kind of different way. And it may be that your encounter with Jesus triggers an equally kind of sudden transformation. However, for others, and I suggest probably the majority of us, the transformation is a more gentle, more gradual one. For the woman in Wednesday's reading, the woman who encounters Jesus by a well, the change is perhaps less striking than some of those others recorded in the Gospels. Outwardly, at least, there appears to be no change. She's not healed from sickness, nor set free from evil spirits, or brought back from the dead. But equally, in that moment, you could also say that everything changes. The woman is often referred to as a sort of scarlet woman, a woman who has sinned by having had 5 husbands. But that reading of the woman is to sort of take our 21st century culture and to impose it onto the passage. The reality of that time and that place is that women didn't choose to leave their husbands. They didn't have the same rights and privileges as in our society, but rather they were kind of treated almost as possessions. And the fact that she's had 5 husbands indicates that she's probably been discarded, either because she was barren, or maybe she's been passed on to her husband's brother following his death, and passed down the family line from brother to brother. And either of those situations, neither of which were any fault of her own, would probably have left her feeling ashamed, maybe a bit used and a bit broken. But yet, after her encounter with Jesus, she leaves knowing that she is accepted, welcomed, and most importantly, loved by the God who created her. And that then, I'm kind of guessing, would lead to a more outward transformation as she draws closer to God and learns more of his love for her and his plan for her life. Because transformation is not merely a kind of one-time thing. Our stories of transformation are an ongoing work in progress. I spoke a couple of weeks ago about my dislike for the term convert when we talk about evangelism, because it implies that there's a sort of a boundary line, a barrier that once crossed means we're in, where once we were out. But that kind of thinking then, I think, often leads us to stop, to think that our story of transformation has already happened and that it is somehow finished. But I don't think that is the case. Rather, we're invited to walk with Jesus, to start a journey of becoming more like him. And so our transformation is always happening, always ongoing, and we must be willing to allow that to happen. To expect that as we approach Jesus through reading our Bible or in prayer, as we walk with him day by day, that he's going to change us, that we will be transformed and made new little by little. An author named Bret Harte wrote a story about the Wild West called The Luck of Roaring Camp. And Roaring Camp was the meanest, toughest mining town in all of the West. There were more murders and thefts than any other place around. And Roaring Camp was inhabited entirely by men, except for one woman who made her living in the only way she knew how. And her name was Cherokee Sal. Eventually, Cherokee Sal becomes pregnant and she gave birth to a baby. She died in childbirth and no one knew exactly who the father might be. The men put the baby girl in a box with some old rags under her, but somehow that just didn't seem right. So one of the men rode 80 miles to buy a rosewood cradle. When they put the rags and the baby in the beautiful new cradle, the rags just didn't look right. So another man rode to Sacramento and purchased some silk and lacy blankets. The men lined the rosewood cradle with silk and tucked the new blanket around the little baby girl. But then someone noticed that the floor under the cradle looked dirty. The next thing you knew, a few of those big, tough men got down on their hands and their knees and scrubbed that floor until it was spotless. Of course, then the walls and the ceiling and the dirty windows looked awful. So they washed down the walls and the ceiling, and they even hung some clean white curtains on the windows. Things were beginning to look a lot better, but they soon realised that they had to give up their carousing and their fighting. After all, the baby needed a lot of sleep, and babies can't sleep during a brawl. Besides all that, the baby didn't like angry voices or frowning faces, so the men started smiling and talking in pleasant, cheerful tones. And since babies shouldn't be left alone, they set the cradle by the entrance of the mine, and one of the men stayed next to her while the others worked. Then someone noticed just how ugly the mine entrance was, so they planted some flowers and made a small garden near the cradle. And as they worked, the men looked for shiny little stones that they could show to the baby and watch her gurgle and coo. But when they held the stones down near her, they saw that their hands looked black and dirty, and they didn't want to scare the little baby with their scraggly hair and wild beards. And pretty soon the general store sold out of soap and shaving gear. I think that story is a kind of illustration of how it is with Jesus. As we draw closer to him, as we allow him into more and more of our lives, so our lives will become transformed as he begins to influence every aspect of our life, not in a way that takes away, but one that enhances and enlarges. And these changes aren't done begrudgingly, but willingly, as we move closer to gaining that life in all its fullness, which Jesus offers to us. And that then brings us onto the other question that we need to ask ourselves. And that is, how does our story of transformation affect those around us? And for this, I want to look at a story not in our readings for the week, but one from Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. It's the story of Zacchaeus, who climbed a tree to watch Jesus from a distance, but ends up hosting him for tea at his house. And as a result of that encounter with Jesus, Zacchaeus decides to give half of his wealth away to the poor and to pay back anyone that he had ever cheated. Basically, Zacchaeus' encounter with Jesus is good news, not just for Zacchaeus, but also for the whole community. And there's perhaps a challenge there for each of us, isn't there? Is our story of transformation good news, not just for us, but for those around us as well. I imagine that for that community, for those people who lived in and around Zacchaeus, the day Zacchaeus met Jesus was a day that they would never forget. A day of real celebration. And we perhaps need to ask ourselves, is that true for us too? Is our faith in Jesus good news for those around us? Is it good news for our family, for our friends, for our workplace, for the community in which we live? In the reflection yesterday, there was a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was an American essayist, lecturer, philosopher, abolitionist and poet of the mid-19th century. And the quote was this: "What you do speaks so loudly that I cannot hear what you're saying." As we draw closer to Jesus, as we allow ourselves to be transformed and to become more like him, may we, like Jesus, be people who not only preach good news, but who are good news to those around us. As our lived stories of transformation speak of him and of his love. Let's close in prayer. Lord God, we thank you for the ways in which you change us for the better. Please let those changes be visible in us, so that others may see them and may give you the glory. Amen.